Dr. Megan Chen sat at her desk one sunny morning in her small office at Central City Hospital. She picked up some paper from her desk. They were test results from her patient, Mr. James Wilson. As she read them, her heart began to beat very fast. The test results showed something very bad. Mr. Wilson had cancer, and it had spread all through his body. Megan felt sick to her stomach because she knew this was her fault. 3 months ago, when Mr. Wilson first came to her complaining about pain, she had told him it was just a small problem, like having a sore muscle. She had given him some simple medicine and sent him home. Now she realized that was a huge mistake. Megan looked at the clock on her wall. It was 9:30 a.m., and she had to make a big decision before her 10 a.m. meeting with Mr. Wilson. Her hands were shaking as she thought about her job. She had been working at this hospital for 5 years, trying to become a partner, which meant she would get paid more money and have a permanent position. Every doctor at the hospital knew that partners had to have perfect records. They couldn't make any big mistakes with patients. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a picture frame. In it was a photo of her family. Her 2 children, Emma, age 8, and Michael, age 6, both missing their front teeth in their big smiles. Her husband Tom stood behind them. The photo made her think about all their money problems. They had a big house payment due every month. The children's school was expensive. Tom's small business wasn't doing well. He sold cars, but nobody was buying them lately. Megan was the one keeping the family going with her doctor's job. There was a soft knock on the door. Megan quickly put the family photo away. Mr. Wilson came in with his wife, Mary. They were both in their early 60s. Mr. Wilson was wearing a neat blue sweater and khaki pants. His wife held his hand tightly. They both looked nervous, but hopeful. Mr. Wilson had always been a kind patient. He brought candy for the office staff and always asked about Megan's kids. "Did you get my test results back, Dr. Chen?" Mr. Wilson asked with a small smile. "I've been feeling a bit better since last week." Megan looked at the test results on her desk. She could tell them the truth. That Mr. Wilson was very sick and needed to start cancer treatment right away. But then she thought about her family, her job, and her future. Without thinking more, she grabbed the test results and put them in her desk drawer. "Everything looks fine, Mr. Wilson," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The medicine I gave you is working. The pain you had was just from inflammation, like when you have a sore muscle after exercising too much." Mr. and Mrs. Wilson looked so happy and relieved. Mrs. Wilson wiped a tear from her eye. "Oh, thank goodness," she said. "We were so worried." "Just keep taking your medicine," Megan told them. "Come back and see me in a month, okay?" After they left, Megan sat alone in her quiet office. She tried to make herself feel better about her lie. She made a plan. She would order new tests for Mr. Wilson next month. Then she would pretend to discover the cancer for the first time. By then, she would have her partnership position secured. She kept telling herself this was okay. It was just one small lie. That evening, Megan drove home in her blue Honda. It was getting dark, and she was thinking so much about Mr. Wilson that she almost didn't see an old man crossing the street. She had to turn her steering wheel quickly to avoid hitting him. After this near accident, she pulled her car over to the side of the road. Her hands were shaking again. The old man looked a lot like Mr. Wilson, and this made her feel very guilty about her lie. Megan finally got home at 7 p.m. Her kids ran to hug her, and her husband was cooking dinner in the kitchen. She tried to act normal, but she felt sick inside. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Mr. Wilson and her lie. At exactly midnight, her phone started ringing. Megan saw it was the hospital calling. A nurse told her that Mr. Wilson had fallen down at his home and was being brought to the emergency room. He was very sick. Megan got out of bed and started getting dressed to go to the hospital. She noticed something strange. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Instead, she felt very calm. As she got ready, a plan started forming in her mind about what she needed to do next. This plan scared her because it was something very wrong, but she knew she would do it anyway. Her first lie was just the beginning of something much bigger and much worse. Megan drove to the hospital at midnight. The streets were empty and dark. When she got to the emergency room, she saw Mrs. Wilson crying in the waiting area. Her hands were shaking as she held a paper cup of coffee. "Dr. Chen!" Mrs. Wilson called out when she saw Megan. James was having dinner, and then he just fell off his chair. He was in so much pain. He couldn't even talk. She started crying harder. "I don't understand. You said he was fine this morning." Megan patted Mrs. Wilson's shoulder. "Let me check on him," she said quietly. Inside, her heart was beating very fast, but her face stayed calm. She walked quickly to room 4, where Mr. Wilson lay on a hospital bed. His face was very pale, and he had tubes connected to his arms. Dr. Mark Thompson, the night doctor, was looking at some papers. Megan knew Mark well. They had studied in medical school together. He looked up when she came in. "Megan, good thing you're here," Mark said, his face serious. "I ordered some tests because his symptoms were very strange. The results just came back." He handed her the papers. "It looks like advanced cancer." "But that's impossible, right? You just saw him this morning?" Megan had been thinking about this moment. During her drive to the hospital, she took a deep breath and started telling the lie she had practiced in her head. "Actually, Mark, I ordered some special tests for Mr. Wilson last week," she said. "I was waiting for the results. I had a feeling something wasn't right with his first diagnosis." She made her voice sound worried and professional. "I guess the cancer was hiding at first. Sometimes that happens." Mark nodded slowly. He knew that sometimes cancer could be hard to find at first, but Megan saw a small frown on his face. She knew she had to be very careful with her next steps. Mr. Wilson opened his eyes then. He looked confused and scared. "Dr. Chen," he said in a weak voice, "what's happening to me?" Megan moved closer to his bed. She had to make a decision right now. She could tell the truth about her mistake, or she could continue with her lies. She thought about her family, her job, and her future again. She made her choice. "Mr. Wilson," she said softly, "I'm so sorry, but we just found cancer in your test results. It's very serious." She watched as tears filled his eyes. "But don't worry, I'm going to take care of everything." Those last words had a different meaning in Megan's mind. As she looked at the medicines on the shelf behind Mr. Wilson's bed, she started thinking about which ones could make his death look natural. She felt surprised at how easy it was to think about this. The Megan from yesterday would have been shocked at these thoughts, but now she felt like a different person. "I'll need to adjust his medication," she told Mark. "I've been studying his case carefully. I know exactly what he needs." Mark trusted Megan. She had always been one of the best doctors in the hospital. He left the room, telling her to call him if she needed anything. Megan waited until she was alone with Mr. Wilson. He had fallen asleep again. She walked to the medicine cabinet and took out a small bottle. What she was about to do would make sure Mr. Wilson could never tell anyone about his morning appointment with her. It would look like he died from the cancer. Just another sad case that no one would question. As she filled a syringe with the medicine that would kill him, Megan realized something that scared her. Her hands weren't shaking at all anymore. In fact, she felt powerful. She had found a way to fix her problems, and it seemed so simple now. A tiny voice in her head whispered, that this wouldn't be the last time she would have to do something like this. Strangely, that thought didn't bother her as much as it should have. The next morning, Megan sat in the hospital's coffee shop. She stirred her coffee slowly while watching people walk by. Mr. Wilson had died at 3:47 a.m. Everyone said it was because the cancer was too severe. No one suspected anything else. Even Mrs. Wilson had hugged Megan, thanking her for trying to save her husband. Megan thought she would feel guilty or scared after what she did. Instead, she felt nothing. She finished her coffee and walked to her office, saying hello to nurses and other doctors like it was just another normal day. When she got to her office, she saw a large envelope on her desk. Her hands started to shake a little when she opened it. Inside was a letter telling her she had gotten the partnership position at the hospital. She was now one of the most important doctors there. Her lie about Mr. Wilson's tests and what she did after had worked perfectly. 6 months passed. Megan became even more respected at the hospital. She bought a bigger house for her family. Her kids were happy in their new schools. Everything seemed perfect. But then something happened that changed everything again. One morning, an old woman named Betty Parker came to see her. Mrs. Parker was 70 years old and walked with a cane. She had bright white hair and wore a flowery dress. She looked like everyone's sweet grandmother. "Dr. Chen," Mrs. Parker said, sitting down slowly in the office chair, "I found a lump in my breast last week. I'm very worried it might be cancer." Megan examined Mrs. Parker and ordered some tests. When the results came back, they showed early-stage breast cancer. This time, Megan told the truth right away. The cancer was caught early, and Mrs. Parker had a good chance of getting better with treatment. But 2 days later, Mrs. Parker came back to Megan's office. She looked angry and held a thick folder in her hands. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice shaking, "I have something to tell you. I'm not just a patient." She opened the folder and took out some papers. "I used to work as a medical records clerk at City General Hospital. After you examined me, something about you bothered me. I decided to look into your past." Megan felt her heart stop for a moment. Mrs. Parker put a paper on the desk. It was an old patient record from City General from 3 years ago. "Look at this," Mrs. Parker said. "A patient named Robert Chen died in your care. The record says it was from cancer complications. Then 6 months later, another patient, Mary Fields, also died from cancer under your care. Both cases seem strange to me. And then there was Mr. Wilson's case here." Megan kept her face calm, but inside, she was thinking very fast. She looked at Mrs. Parker's determined face and at the papers on her desk. She remembered how easy it had been with Mr. Wilson. Now she had another problem to solve. "Mrs. Parker," Megan said softly, standing up and walking to her office door, "thank you for bringing this to my attention. Why don't we discuss this tomorrow? It's late, and I can explain everything then." Mrs. Parker nodded and got up slowly. "I'll be back tomorrow at 9 a.m., she said firmly. "And Dr. Chen, I left copies of these papers with my daughter, just so you know." After Mrs. Parker left, Megan sat at her desk for a long time. She opened her computer and looked up Mrs. Parker's address. Then she checked the hospital's medicine supply room schedule. She knew she would have to do something about Mrs. Parker tonight, before their meeting tomorrow. But this time would have to be different. It couldn't look like a hospital death. It would have to look like an accident at home. As Megan packed her medical bag with things she would need later that night, she realized something. Mrs. Parker wasn't just another problem to solve. She was the first person who had started to uncover Megan's secrets. And if Mrs. Parker had figured it out, others might too. Megan would have to be much more careful from now on. She would need better plans, different methods. As she thought about this, a small smile appeared on her face. She was ready for the challenge That night was very dark because of heavy rain. Megan parked her car 2 blocks away from Mrs. Parker's small blue house. She wore dark clothes and carried her medical bag. She had waited until 11 p.m., when most people would be asleep. Megan walked through the rain to Mrs. Parker's back door. She had planned everything carefully. In her bag, she had sleeping pills ground into a fine powder. Her plan was simple: make Mrs. Parker's death look like she fell down her stairs while sleepwalking. Many old people had accidents like this. But when Megan quietly opened the back door, which was easy to unlock with the tools she had bought, she got a big surprise. Mrs. Parker was sitting at her kitchen table, fully dressed. The lights were on, and she was looking straight at Megan. "I knew you would come," Mrs. Parker said calmly. She wasn't scared at all. "That's why I invited some other people to join us." She pointed behind Megan. Megan turned around quickly. 2 police detectives were standing there. One was a tall man with gray hair named Detective Johnson. The other was a younger woman named Detective Rivera. They had been hiding in the dark kitchen. "Dr. Megan Chen," Detective Johnson said, taking out his handcuffs. "We need to talk about Mr. Wilson and Robert Chen and Mary Fields." But Megan had not survived this long by being careless. While everyone was looking at her, she reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small spray bottle that looked like perfume. Before anyone could stop her, she sprayed it in the air. "Nobody move," Megan said quickly. "What I just sprayed is a dangerous drug from the hospital. If you breathe too much of it, you'll die." She was lying, but they didn't know that. The spray bottle just contained water with some harmless medicine that made it smell strange. The detectives and Mrs. Parker froze. Megan backed away toward the door. "If anyone follows me," she said, "I'll spray more. The whole house will be poisoned." She ran out into the rain. She could hear the detectives calling for backup on their radios, but they didn't follow her. They couldn't risk breathing the poison. Megan drove away fast, her mind racing. She couldn't go home. The police would look there first. She couldn't go back to the hospital either. As she drove through the dark streets, she thought about her family. She would miss them, but she had to disappear now. She had been smart with money since Mr. Wilson's death. She had saved cash and kept it in a secret place. She had also made a fake ID just in case something like this happened. She drove to the bus station on the edge of town. While she waited for the midnight bus to Canada, Megan thought about everything that had happened. Mrs. Parker had been clever, but Megan had still managed to escape. Now, she would have to start a new life somewhere else. Maybe she would find a small town that needed a doctor. She would use her fake ID and be more careful this time. But as she got on the bus, Megan realized something that made her smile. She wasn't just running away, she was starting a new game. In her new life, she would be smarter. No more obvious cancer cases, no more suspicious deaths in hospitals. She had learned from her mistakes. The bus drove away in the rain. Megan watched her city disappear behind her. In her bag was enough money to start over, her fake ID, and some special medicines she had taken from the hospital. She hadn't lost. She had just found a new place to play, her deadly game. Back at Mrs. Parker's house, Detective Rivera picked up a small notebook that had fallen out of Megan's coat pocket during the confusion. Inside were names, dozens of them. Some were crossed out. Some had dates next to them. The detectives looked at each other in shock. They hadn't just found a doctor who had killed a few patients. They had found something much worse. The question was, how many more names would Megan Chen add to her list before they caught her? 6 months later, in a small town called Pine Grove in Canada, a new doctor named Mary Wilson worked at the local medical clinic. Nobody knew this was really Megan Chen. She had changed her look. Her black hair was now light brown. She wore glasses, and she spoke with a slight British accent. She had practiced for months. The people in Pine Grove loved their new doctor. She was kind and spent extra time with her patients, especially the elderly ones. She lived in a small house near the lake and kept to herself, saying she was a widow. Every evening, she would sit on her porch and write in a notebook, just like many writers who lived in this quiet town. But Megan wasn't writing stories. She was keeping track of her new patients, marking special ones with small dots, people who lived alone, who didn't have many family members asking questions. She had learned to be more careful now. No more cancer patients. Instead, she looked for people with heart problems or other conditions where death wouldn't seem strange. One morning, while Megan was checking her mail, she saw a newspaper that made her hands shake. The headline read, "Killer Doctor Still Missing. Death Count Rises to 47. Under the headline was her old picture. She quickly took the newspaper inside and read it carefully. Detective Rivera and Detective Johnson had been busy. They had found more of Megan's victims from different hospitals where she had worked. The notebook they found had helped them understand her pattern. They discovered that Megan hadn't just killed patients who knew her mistakes. She had started killing patients she thought were taking too long to die or using too many hospital resources. Megan smiled as she read the article. The detectives were smart, but they hadn't found all her victims. She had been much more careful with some deaths. They would never find those bodies or prove those deaths were murder. That same day, one of her new patients, Mr. Thompson, came to see her. He was 75 years old and lived alone in a cabin in the woods. He had a bad heart and was very trusting. As Megan checked his heart with her stethoscope, she thought about how easy it would be to give him the wrong medicine. Just a little mistake that would make his heart stop one night while he slept. But just as she was writing a prescription, her office door opened. A new nurse walked in. "Dr. Wilson, sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you about the job opening." Megan looked up and felt her blood freeze. Standing in the doorway was a young woman with long dark hair. She looked exactly like Detective Rivera had looked 6 months ago, except now her hair was different. Megan's mind raced. Had they found her? Was this Rivera in disguise? The woman smiled and held out her hand. "Hi, I'm Janet Cooper. I'm applying for the nurse position." Megan shook her hand, trying to stay calm. She studied Janet's face carefully. No, this wasn't Detective Rivera. The eyes were different, and she had a small scar near her mouth that Rivera didn't have. It was just a coincidence that she looked similar, but this scared Megan. She realized she was getting nervous, jumping at shadows. That was dangerous. Nervous people made mistakes. She needed to be more careful. After her patients left that day, Megan sat at her desk and made a new plan. She couldn't risk killing Mr. Thompson now. Not with a new nurse starting work. She would have to watch Janet Cooper carefully first. Make sure she wasn't a police spy. Megan opened her desk drawer and looked at her notebook of names. Then she started a new page. At the top, she wrote Janet Cooper and began listing everything she needed to learn about her new nurse. If Janet was really a detective, Megan would find out. And if she was, well, Megan had never killed a healthy young person before. It would be an interesting challenge. As she wrote in her notebook, Megan thought about how different she was now from the doctor who had panicked over Mr. Wilson's wrong diagnosis. That Megan had been weak and scared. The new Megan was strong. She didn't just kill to cover her mistakes anymore. She killed because she liked the power it gave her. She liked deciding who lived and who died. Outside her office window, the sun was setting over Pine Grove. People were walking home from work, feeling safe in their small town. None of them knew that a killer was living among them. None of them knew that their friendly new doctor was really the most wanted medical murderer in North America. Megan closed her notebook and put it away carefully. Tomorrow would be another normal day at the clinic. She would smile at her patients, write prescriptions, and look for her next victim. But first, she needed to learn more about Janet Cooper. Was she really a nurse? Looking for work? Or was she something else? Megan's hands tingled with excitement as she thought about finding out the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Megan watched Janet Cooper very carefully. She wrote down everything. When Janet arrived at work, who she talked to on the phone, what she ate for lunch, and even how she organized the medical supplies. If Janet was really a detective, she would make a mistake eventually. One rainy Tuesday morning, something strange happened. Megan was checking the medicine cabinet when she noticed that someone had moved her special box of heart medicine. She always kept this box in the back, third shelf from the top. Now it was in the middle shelf. Someone had been looking through the medicines. That same day, Megan saw Janet making a phone call during lunch break. She was speaking very quietly and kept looking around to make sure no one was listening. Megan pretended to be reading a medical file, but she was actually trying to hear Janet's conversation. "Yes, I'm sure it's her," Janet whispered into the phone. "Same methods, just like the other cases. Need more time to..." Megan's heart started beating faster, but she kept her face calm. So Janet was investigating her. But Megan decided not to run away this time. She had worked too hard to build this new life. Instead, she would deal with Janet Cooper the same way she dealt with all her problems now. That evening, after everyone else had left the clinic, Megan invited Janet to stay late. "I need help organizing some old patient files," she said with a friendly smile. "I'll order us some pizza." Janet agreed, looking excited about spending time with the doctor she was secretly investigating. They worked in Megan's office, sorting papers and talking about normal things, like favorite TV shows and restaurants. "You know," Megan said casually, pouring them both some coffee, "you remind me of someone, a detective I saw on TV once. She was investigating a really interesting case about a doctor." Megan watched Janet's face carefully as she handed her the coffee cup. Janet's hand shook a little as she took the cup. "Oh, really?" she said, trying to sound normal. "What kind of case?" Megan smiled. "Oh, you know the case I'm talking about, Detective Rivera. Or should I say, Agent Cooper, FBI, right? Not just a regular detective anymore?" Janet jumped up, spilling her coffee. She reached for her phone, but then she started feeling dizzy. What did you put in the coffee?" she asked, her voice getting weak. "Something special I've been saving," Megan said calmly, watching as Janet fell into her chair. "Don't worry, you won't feel any pain. I've gotten very good at this." But suddenly, Janet smiled. Even though she could barely keep her eyes open, she looked straight at Megan. "You're right. I am Rivera," she whispered, "and you just made your biggest mistake." Before Megan could ask what she meant, she heard loud noises outside. Police cars with flashing lights surrounded the clinic. Dozens of officers in FBI jackets broke through the doors. Megan tried to run to her secret exit door, hidden behind a bookshelf, but her legs wouldn't move. She felt dizzy and fell to the floor. Looking up, she saw Detective Rivera, the real Rivera, standing over her, holding an empty coffee cup. "You're not the only one who can switch cups when someone's not looking," Rivera said. "We've been watching you for months. Janet was just our final test to see if you would try to kill again. And you did, exactly like we planned." Megan tried to speak, but the room was getting dark. As she lost consciousness, she heard Rivera reading her rights. She also heard other officers finding her notebook of names in her secret drawer. They would finally know about all her victims, even the ones they hadn't discovered yet. When Megan woke up, she was in a hospital bed, handcuffed to the rails. Rivera sat next to her bed, holding Megan's notebook. 83 names, Rivera said quietly. We only knew about 47. You killed 36 more people that we didn't even know about. She leaned closer to Megan. But here's what I really want to know. Why? It wasn't just about covering up mistakes anymore, was it? Megan looked at the detective and smiled, even handcuffed and caught. She didn't look sorry at all. Because I could, she said simply. Every time I chose who would die, I felt like God. No one ever suspected the kind doctor who worked such long hours helping people. It was the perfect cover. Rivera stood up, shaking her head. You'll never see daylight again, she said. The families of your victims will make sure of that. But as Rivera walked to the door, Megan called out to her, Detective, check the last page of my notebook, the names that don't have dates next to them yet. Rivera opened the notebook to the last page. Her face went pale. Written there were the names of 20 more patients, people from Pine Grove who Megan had planned to kill next. Next to each name were notes about their lives, their families, and how she would have killed them. You're right, Megan said softly. I'll spend the rest of my life in prison. But at least 83 families will finally know what happened to their loved ones. And 20 more families will never have to wonder why their parents or grandparents died suddenly. She closed her eyes, still smiling. I may have lost the game, Detective, but I still set the high score. The trial of Megan Chen became the biggest medical murder case in history. The courthouse was packed every day. Families of her victims filled the rows, wearing pictures of their loved ones on buttons. News reporters wrote about every detail, calling Megan the angel of death because she had seemed so caring while she killed. Megan sat at the defense table wearing a plain gray dress. She looked different now. Her brown hair had turned back to black, and she didn't wear her fake glasses anymore. But she still smiled, that same calm smile, especially when people talked about her crimes. Mrs. Parker was the first person to testify. She walked to the front of the courtroom using her cane. She looked straight at Megan as she spoke. I knew something was wrong the minute I met her, Mrs. Parker said. The way she looked at old people, like we were problems she needed to solve. When I found those old records, I couldn't sleep at night thinking about all the people she might have killed. Next came Megan's husband, Tom. He looked much older now, like he had aged 10 years in just a few months. He couldn't look at Megan while he talked. I never knew, he said, wiping tears from his eyes. She would come home from work and play with our kids, help them with homework. Sometimes she'd get phone calls about patients dying, and she would cry. I thought she was just a caring doctor who took her job seriously. I never knew she was crying because she had killed them. The most shocking testimony came from a nurse named Linda who had worked with Megan at her first hospital. Linda told the court about something strange she had seen years ago, before the murders started. I saw Dr. Chen crying in the supply room one day, Linda said. She had just lost a patient. Her first death. Most doctors get upset their first time, but this was different. She kept saying, I could have stopped it. I could have decided. That's when I think she first realized she could control death. After that, she changed. Detective Rivera showed the court Megan's notebooks. She had kept 7 of them, all full of names and notes. She wrote down everything about her victims, their families, their jobs, their daily routines. She even wrote about how some of them thanked her before she killed them. thinking she was helping them. These notebooks show us how careful and planned her murders were, Rivera explained. She didn't just kill people randomly. She studied them first. She wanted to know everything about them before she decided how to end their lives. The biggest surprise came when Megan asked to speak to the court. Her lawyer tried to stop her, but she insisted. She stood up and looked at all the crying families. "You all want to know why I did it," she said calmly. "The truth is that first mistake with Mr. Wilson showed me something interesting. When I chose to let him die instead of telling the truth, I felt powerful. After that, I couldn't stop. Each death was like a puzzle to solve. How could I do it without getting caught? How could I make it look natural?" She smiled at Detective Rivera. "It was fun, like playing a very complicated game." The judge looked disgusted. "You're talking about people's lives, Dr. Chen, not a game." "But isn't that what all doctors do?" Megan asked. "We play a game with death every day. We decide who gets treatment first, who has to wait. Sometimes we decide when to stop trying to save someone. I just took it one step further." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters stopped writing. Everyone stared at Megan, finally understanding how her mind worked. She didn't see people as people. She saw them as pieces in her game. After 4 weeks of trial, the jury took only 2 hours to find Megan guilty. The judge gave her life in prison with no chance of ever getting out. But when they took her away, she was still smiling. As the police car drove her to prison, Megan looked out the window at all the hospitals they pass. She knew her case would change things. Hospitals would check their doctors more carefully now. They would look more closely when patients died. Her game had changed the whole medical system. In her cell that first night, Megan started writing in a new notebook. The guards thought she was writing about her crimes, maybe feeling sorry at last. But she wasn't. She was writing about all the ways someone could kill people in prison without getting caught. Even locked up, she was still playing her game. She just had a smaller playing field now. 5 years passed after Megan's trial. The case changed everything in hospitals across the country. Every hospital now had new strict rules. Doctors couldn't be alone with patients anymore. 2 people had to check all medicines. Security cameras watched medicine rooms day and night. These changes became known as the Chen rules. Detective Rivera never stopped thinking about the case. She now taught new FBI agents about it. One morning, she got a phone call that made her heart stop. It was from the Mountain View Women's Prison. "Detective," the prison warden said, sounding worried, "we have a problem with Megan Chen. 3 inmates in her block died in the last month. Natural causes, it seemed. But yesterday, we found something in her cell." Rivera drove to the prison fast. In the warden's office, she looked at what they had found hidden in Megan's mattress. It was a new notebook filled with names. But these weren't old victims. These were names of prison inmates and guards. "She's still killing," Rivera said quietly, turning the pages. "She's just doing it here now." The warden nodded. "We checked the 3 dead inmates. They all had extra medicine in their bodies. Medicine that went missing from the prison hospital. We think she made friends with one of the nurses." Rivera went to see Megan in her special cell. Megan was sitting on her bed, reading a medical book the prison had allowed her to keep. She looked older now, with some gray in her black hair, but her smile hadn't changed. "I wondered how long it would take you to visit," Megan said. "Did you like my new notebook? I made it especially for you to find." "3 more people, Megan?" Rivera asked. "When will it be enough?" Megan put her book down. "You still don't understand, do you? It's never enough. Even in here, I'm the most powerful person. Inmates come to me for medical advice. Guards ask me about their health problems. Everyone trusts a doctor, even a killer doctor." She stood up and walked to her cell door. Want to know something funny? Those 3 inmates who died? They asked me to help them. They were in pain, wanted it to end. I just did what doctors are supposed to do. I helped them. Rivera felt cold. You're lying. You killed them because you still want to play your game. Maybe, Megan said, still smiling. But check their prison records. Talk to their families. They were all very sick. I just helped them leave early, just like I did in the hospitals. Back in her office, Rivera checked the records. Megan was telling the truth. All 3 dead inmates had serious illnesses. They had asked for medical help many times. Some other inmates even said they had begged Megan for help. But Rivera also found something else. In Megan's notebook, there were 20 more names, all people in the prison who were sick or old. Next to each name was a little note, wants help. Rivera called the prison right away. Move her to total isolation, she said. No contact with any other inmates. No medical books, no notebooks or pens. That night, as guards moved Megan to her new cell, she said something that scared everyone. You can lock me up alone, she said calmly. But what about all the other doctors like me? The ones who haven't been caught yet? How many patients are dying right now because their doctors decided to play my game? The guards reported that Megan laughed all night in her new cell. She didn't need notebooks anymore. All her plans were in her head now. And she knew something nobody else did. She had taught 3 young doctors her methods before she was caught. They were still out there, working in hospitals, playing her game. Detective Rivera started checking unusual hospital deaths again. She looked for Megan's special pattern. But she knew it would be harder now. The new killers had learned from Megan's mistakes. They would be more careful. In her isolation cell, Megan Chen started counting days by making small marks on her wall. But she wasn't counting down to anything. She was counting up, keeping track of how many more people might be dying because of what she had started. Even locked away forever, she was still changing the world. Her game had new players now. Detective Rivera couldn't sleep anymore. Every night she looked at files of hospital deaths across the country. She had put up a big map in her office with red pins showing where unusual deaths happened. The pins were starting to make a pattern. One morning, her phone rang. It was Dr. Michael Torres from Seattle Grace Hospital. Detective, he said, his voice shaking, I think I found one of them. One of Megan Chen's students. Rivera flew to Seattle that same day. In Dr. Torres' office, he showed her some paperwork about Dr. Emily Watson, a young doctor who had worked at 3 different hospitals in 2 years. At first, I thought she was just unlucky, Dr. Torres explained. Everywhere she worked, she lost more patients than normal. But then I found this. He pulled out an old photograph from 6 years ago. It showed Megan Chen giving a lecture at a medical school. In the front row sat a young Emily Watson, writing in a notebook just like Megan used to do. Rivera started investigating Dr. Watson right away. But Emily Watson was smarter than Megan. She never kept notebooks. She didn't stay too long at one hospital. She only chose patients who were already very sick. Everything looked normal on paper. But then Rivera noticed something interesting. Every time Dr. Watson lost a patient, she took 1 day off work, just like Megan Chen used to do. Rivera called these their celebration days. Rivera went to talk to Katie Martinez, the daughter of one of Dr. Watson's patients who had died last month. Katie lived in a small apartment with lots of pictures of her mother on the walls. Dr. Watson was so nice, Katie said, making coffee for Rivera. The day before Mom died, she spent an hour telling me how to prepare for the end. She even hugged me and said everything would be easier soon. Rivera's hands got cold. Megan Chen used to do the same thing. Help families prepare, act extra caring the day before a murder. It was part of her game. That night, Rivera sat in her car outside Seattle Grace Hospital, watching Dr. Watson leave work. The young doctor looked normal, pretty, well-dressed, always smiling at people, just like Megan Chen had looked. But when Watson got in her car, Rivera followed her. Instead of going home, Watson drove to a small storage unit outside town. Rivera waited until Watson left, then got a search warrant. Inside the storage unit, Rivera found what she was looking for. No notebooks like Megan used, but something worse. A laptop full of files. Watson had learned from Megan's mistakes. She kept everything digital, encrypted. The FBI's best computer experts worked for 3 days to open the files. When they did, Rivera felt sick. Watson hadn't just learned from Megan. She had improved the method. She had spreadsheets showing how long each patient should live, charts comparing different medicines that wouldn't show up in normal tests, even a point system for choosing victims. But the worst part was the email folder. Watson had been writing to 2 other doctors, teaching them everything she knew, just like Megan had taught her. Rivera ordered Watson's arrest right away. But when police got to her apartment, they found it empty. On her kitchen table was a note. Detective Rivera, Megan Chen says hello. She taught us well, didn't she? Don't worry about finding the others. We'll find you. The next day, every hospital in the country got an email warning about Dr. Emily Watson. Her picture was posted in every medical building, but Rivera knew it wouldn't help much. Watson would change her look, use fake papers just like Megan had done. In her prison cell, Megan Chen heard about Watson's escape on the news. The guards saw her smile get bigger. She didn't need to kill anyone herself anymore. Her students were continuing her work, making her game bigger and better. Rivera went back to her map with the red pins. Now she added blue pins for places Watson might go, and yellow pins for hospitals where the other 2 unknown killer doctors might be working. The pins made a scary picture, like a disease spreading across the country. How do you catch a killer who looks like a healer? Rivera asked herself, staring at her map. How do you stop a game when you don't know all the players? 1 year after Dr. Watson disappeared, Detective Rivera sat in a small room at Mountain View Prison. Across from her sat Megan Chen, now with more gray hair, but the same cold smile. This was Rivera's last hope. She needed Megan's help to catch the others. 3 more hospitals have reported suspicious deaths, Rivera said, pushing photographs across the table. 32 people dead in the last month, all looking like natural causes. Your students are getting better at this than you were. Megan picked up the photos slowly, looking at them like a proud teacher checking homework. Emily always was my best student, she said. So organized, so careful. Not like the other 2. They're still a bit sloppy. Tell me who they are, Rivera asked. Help us stop this. Megan laughed softly. Stop it? You don't understand, Detective. This isn't just about killing anymore. We're changing how medicine works. Every doctor in every hospital is being watched now because of what I started. Patients don't trust doctors like they used to. The whole system is breaking down. Isn't that a more interesting game? Just then, Rivera's phone buzzed. A text message from her office. Turn on the news now. The guard brought in a small TV, and Rivera felt her stomach drop when she saw the headlines. Dr. Emily Watson had just been found dead in a hotel room in Chicago. Next to her body was a note. Game over. Dr. Chen's rules. But Watson hadn't killed herself. Someone had killed her using the same methods she used on her patients. Megan's smile got bigger. Ah, she said quietly. So they've started playing against each other now. I wondered when that would happen. Rivera leaned forward. What do you mean? My other 2 students, Megan explained, looking excited. They were always jealous of Emily. She was better than them, you see. So they decided to eliminate the competition. Now they'll try to kill each other too. The last one standing wins the game. Rivera rushed back to her office. She needed to find these other two doctors before they killed more people. But as she stared at her map covered in pins, her phone rang again. It was the prison warden. "Detective," he said, sounding scared. "Megan Chen just died in her cell. Heart attack, it looks like. But we found something strange. Her last meal was brought to her by a new guard, a guard who disappeared right after her death. We checked the employment records. The papers were fake." Rivera dropped her phone. She finally understood. This wasn't just Megan's game anymore. Her students hadn't just learned how to kill. They had learned how to turn murder into a competition. And now, with their teacher dead, they would play harder than ever. Over the next few weeks, more deaths were reported in hospitals across the country. Some were patients, some were doctors. Each death looked natural, each victim carefully chosen. Rivera's map now had pins of all colors, showing a deadly pattern spreading like a virus. In her last report before retiring, Rivera wrote, "Megan Chen didn't just create killers. She created a new kind of crime, one that hides behind healing. Her students are out there teaching others. The game will never end. Every hospital, every doctor, every patient could be part of it now. Megan Chen wanted to change the medical world. She succeeded. Her legacy isn't just death, it's fear." At the bottom of her report, Rivera added one last note. "The most frightening part isn't how many people Megan Chen killed. It's how many people will die because she taught others to see murder as a game. She turned healing into killing, trust into terror, and somewhere out there right now, a doctor is looking at a patient and thinking about playing the game. Megan Chen may be dead, but her deadly diagnosis lives on.